You know, one of the most well-known commands in the Bible is be not conformed to this world. And that means don't live like the world does. Don't get your values from the world. Don't do as the world does in its bad habits, in anything really. We're to be set apart in that way. And yet, the irony is with the passage we're going to look at this morning, it's kind of ironic because as we're going to study here in Luke 16, you're going to hear Jesus saying that there's a problem in your life. And the way for you to solve this problem is to really look at the way the world solves it and to do as they do and learn from them. And you know, at first, when you hear Jesus give this parable, it really kind of goes against the grain of everything we've been taught in the scriptures. And it really makes you question, you know, what does he mean by this? What are we supposed to do with this parable? And yet Jesus is indeed going to tell us that there is a worldly value, a worldly ambition, one that you and I to recognize and in a sense adopt. He does this through the parable of the unjust steward here in Luke chapter 16. You know, scholars often say that parables, they are stories, right? But they're stories that obviously Jesus is telling and he's using to teach us lessons. Good lessons, valuable lessons. But if you study the parables closely, you'll recognize that often these are good lessons being taught from bad examples. Parables, in a sense, really are good lessons from bad examples. And this is, without a doubt, the case in the parable we're going to look at today. In our passage today, we're going to look at a story of an unjust, an unrighteous manager. Unjust because no doubt Jesus calls him unjust. And yet, through this parable of this unjust manager, Jesus identifies a helpful lesson, one that he draws from the story that he encourages all of God's people to recognize and to adopt. You have your Bibles open to Luke 16. I don't know if you were here several months back on Father's Day. We actually finished up Luke 15. We were looking at the parable of the prodigal son. And at the end of Luke 15, that parable there, we found Jesus teaching us how we can relate and how we should relate to the lost. The concern there was how we're to live with the lost of this world. And now in Luke 16, he turns his attentions to the ethics of the kingdom, particularly in the handling of our money, of how we can handle the possessions we have. The idea that we're to be generous here. So Luke 15 showed us how we're to relate to the lost, and Jesus said that we should be compassionate, and we're to reach out to the unsaved. Now here, beginning in Luke 16:1, Jesus begins to encourage his disciples to be generous with what God has given them, and not to hoard those resources for themselves. In Luke 16:1, we begin reading, he said also to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward. Now, what is a steward? Well, we don't use that word today to identify managers like this, but if you could picture a kind of a money manager, someone who helps you to manage your finances, that's really what this gentleman did for this rich man here. He was a manager of his wealth, of his business affairs. He directed those underneath him. And so that often included all kinds of things today, writing personal loans in exchange for interest or financial stake in someone's enterprise. In any case, this steward managed this guy's money. And it says here in verse 1 that he'd been wasting his owner's substances. And then it says that an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. Somehow the manager was reported. Literally, he was accused by some unnamed source. And this accusation was that he was wasting. Now that word wasting, it's actually the same word that was brought up in Luke 15, verse 13. Do you remember when the prodigal son was wasteful, right? He was wasting his inheritance by sensual living. And so in that same way, he is wasting his master's goods. And the master, he finds out about this. And then he does a very foolish thing. Well, Luke 16, verse 2. The master, it says, so he called him, the master called the steward. He called him in and he said to him, what is this I hear? Give an account of your stewardship. You can no longer be steward. The master tells the guy essentially, give an account of all that you've been managing for me, because you're no longer going to be my manager moving forward. One scholar said it this way, in the words of Donald Trump, you're fired. The problem is that unlike any smart business guy would do, this manager, he doesn't fire him on the spot. He says, look, I want you to go back and I want you to get an account of all that you've done. Basically, you've got a 2 weeks notice. Now, there's no hope for the guy to keep his job, but I want you to clean out your desk. And I want an accurate record of your irresponsibility. He wants to know what he's done. Now, I don't know if you get the gist, but that right away it tells you that's a pretty foolish thing to do with someone you just told you're going to fire. Work up an account of all your mistakes. Now, that's bad policy. I mean, listen, if you have someone you're going to fire because of foolishness, right, you get rid of them on the spot. You don't give them time with your money and let someone else figure out the mess that you're in. If you put them back in, the only thing they're going to do is think about themselves. They're going to be put back in with a vengeance, and they're going to be focused on personal gain. And you know what? That's exactly what the manager does. He goes back in. This crook, he knew an audit would reveal all of his schemes, which is exactly what his master wanted. He wanted an audit. And so what does he do? Well, he starts thinking. He starts thinking about what he can do to secure his future. He knows that in just a few weeks, he's going to be without a job. And in those days, understand, stewards who controlled the money often lived on the property of the masters. And so he's not only going to be without a job, very likely he'll be without a place to stay. Then, verse 3, the steward said within himself, he begins to speak to himself in his head, and we get to hear his thoughts. He says, what shall I do? For my master is taking away the stewardship from me. And listening to this guy's thoughts, you get a pretty good idea of what kind of a guy he is. I mean, listen to this. I cannot dig. Verse 3, I cannot dig. I am ashamed to beg. This is a proud white-collar worker. He doesn't want to pick up a shovel. He's not interested in manual labor. No, working hard is not for him. He doesn't want to step particularly into a position of lower status of a hard worker, let alone the status of a beggar. He's not going to do that. He needs a place to live. He thinks in his head, well, look, I've got to have somewhere to go. I need food. I need a future that is beneficial to me, one that is that supplies my needs. More than that, though, I need a career. I've got to have status. In other words, I need to be where I am now later on in important places. What am I going to do? He's trapped. And that's when his eureka moment comes about. His bright idea. This guy's got a plan in verse 4. He says to himself, I have resolved what to do so that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. That's what he needs. He needs someone who's going to give him a future. And this is his bright idea. Here's the brilliant scheme that he plans for himself. He's going to go into talk to people who's been working with his master, those that owes his master money. He's going to contact all the people who owe him debts. And one by one, he's going to go through one by one by one by one. And he's going to discount all of their debts. He's going to discount their debts so they would be obligated to him when he is in need. And that when the time comes, he'll be welcomed into their homes. And basically, he'll receive livelihood for the favors that they owe him. It's pretty shrewd if you ask me. Look at verse 5. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him. He said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" The debtor responded in verse 6, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. 50, I mean, that's a 50% discount. Picture this with me. I mean, the guy owes 100 measures of oil. That's probably around 900 to 1,000 gallons of oil in our measurements today. That's probably, in those days, roughly around 3 years' wages. I mean, that's a lot of money. It would have been the product of no less than 150 olive trees, for olive oil was the oil that was valued in these days. It's a debt, a significant debt, a significant amount of money. And he's just going to whack it right in half. That's a pretty good discount. Don't notice, though, he says, can we sit down and can we do this in a hurry? You know, thieves, they're always in a hurry. I don't mean to call salesmen thieves at the car dealership, but if you ever go to a guy, you know, look, this is a huge bargain. Never going to get a deal like this again. Sign here, sign here, sign here. Look, quickly. Today's the last day of the sale. In a hurry, right? Let's do this quickly. Don't leave. I'll give you another 20% off. Look, if you can't sleep on it, friend, I tell you something's not right. If you can't go home and spend the night praying over it, pondering it, that's my standard. I just say no. Well, in this case, however, if somebody offers me 50% off my mortgage, I might not sleep on it. I might not. I don't know. I have to, maybe I'm not supposed to think about that. In any case, that's exactly what this debtor does. The deal is struck. No questions are asked. Nothing about whether this is the wish of the master or why the man is offering him. But you remember, he's going to be coming back for a favor later. The guy who's getting the 50% discount, he doesn't want to know anything at this point. This is a bargain. He just wants to sign on the dotted line and get out as quickly as possible. Imagine a business manager who cuts your debt in half before he leaves the company. Wow. If he's looking for work later, would you give him a job? I mean, that's what he's looking for. The manager goes on to another debtor in verse 7. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe my master?" So he said, quote, 100 measures of wheat. Wow. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. 20% off right on the spot." Some scholars would say this is as much as 100 bushels of wheat. Probably would take around 100 acres of land to produce this amount of wheat. And maybe even 8 to 10 years of labor, depending on the amount of servants the master would have had. I mean, this is an enormous amount of debt. And to get a 20% discount right on the spot, the guy can't sign quick enough. And you see, in lowering these debts, the manager, again, he is ingratiating himself to these debtors so that later he'll get to come back and say, "Hey, you remember what I did for you? You remember when I knocked 50% off that debt? Now it's time to pay up. And in a society like this, an honor-driven society, they would have been required to pay up just to save face. And so, in the end, this is clever. It's shrewd. It's a shrewd way to secure his future. It's so clever that even the master takes time to applaud the manager in verse 8. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Now it's important to notice that Jesus isn't the one praising the manager here, and sometimes we don't catch that minor detail. The praise comes not off of Jesus' lips, but off of the master's lips. Remember, Jesus called the man the unrighteous, the unjust steward. The employer, he's the one who's commending his manager. And he's telling him, look, I've got to hand it to you. I mean, this was a brilliant plan. And from a worldly point of view, you've got to admit it was. But it's important for us, because I know that sometimes this is a difficult parable to listen to this kind of praise. It's important to remember what the manager is being praised for. What is his master commending? He's not applauding the master's dishonesty, the manager's dishonesty. He's not praising his incompetence or his embezzlement. He's not congratulating him for his deception, you see. The master praises the unjust steward in verse 8, quote, because he had dealt shrewdly. That word shrewdness, it's actually the same word you find in the Gospel of Matthew. Do you remember the story on the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus tells of a wise man building his house upon a rock? That same word there for wise, that wise man, it was the same word here that we have for shrewdness. And so in a sense, this was very wise of this man because he was thinking about his future. The manager, this unfaithful guy, he had the smarts to say, look, I need to plan out my future because soon I'm going to be out of work. I'm going to have no place to live. I need friends, people like me, whom I can gain some favors from in the future. And so he uses whatever resources that are at his disposal to secure his future. And it's so clever that even his master is impressed. But here's the takeaway from this parable of the unjust steward. What is the lesson that we're supposed to draw from this? Well, he tells us in verse 8, and it's this, that before we read it, the lesson that we're to draw from what this unjust steward has done is that sinful people of the world, they often find clever and ingenious ways to secure their future. They use the resources, whatever they have at their disposal. They're shrewd. They're wise in that way. They're clever, whether by honesty or by dishonesty, hence the unjust steward. Whatever they have to do so they can secure the best future for themselves. And listen to the rest of verse 8. In fact, let's read it together here. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are shrewder. They're, maybe you might say wiser. They're more clever in their generation than the sons of light. You know, that last part of verse 8 really is the key to the parable. It really is the good lesson that we're to take from this bad example. Remember, Jesus isn't drawing on the man's morals. He's not drawing, or we're not supposed to be learning about business ethics from this parable. No, that's not the point. The point is that often unbelievers, those of the world, the lost, those who don't know the Lord, You know, they're often smarter about the way they use what they've been given than the children of God are. This unjust man was smart enough to prepare himself a future. He was clever enough to use his provisions, his money, to make friendships that could take care of him once he was thrown out. That's what Jesus is drawing on. You know, it's possible to teach an example, a good lesson from a bad example. It's possible to use the mafia and to commend them for their diligence without commending the mafia for their morals. And what Jesus wants us to understand here is that we as God's people, we're to use our wealth. Jesus is encouraging us to use the resources that we've been given shrewdly to make a lasting impact for God's kingdom. Or better yet, use what God has given you with eternity in mind. That's what Jesus has implied up to now, at least in the parable. But it's exactly what he clarifies in verse 9. Verse 9 says, I say to you, make friends for yourselves. How? By means of, by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. Jesus says to use our wealth to gain friends for ourselves. You remember the steward? Do you remember the steward was using the money? It wasn't his. The money belonged to his master. And our money is not ours. Friend, everything you have belongs to God. And what Jesus is telling us to do is just like the steward used his master's money to gain friends, we are to use our master's money, God's money, to gain friends for ourselves. We're to be generous with the resources that God has given us. We're to use our wealth to make friends for ourselves, friends that will one day receive us into eternity. We're to use our material possessions and invest those resources in people's lives and lead people to Christ using whatever resources that are at our disposal. Because when we do that, friend, we are investing in our future, in our eternal future. Now, does that mean that somehow our money saves us? No, that's not the point. We're really talking about eternal rewards. And we're talking about eternity. We're talking about a heavenly portfolio. You know, ask yourself, Christian, what has God given me? What has he entrusted me with? And how can I use it so that when I go to be with the Lord, it will pay off and benefit me in eternity? Because as verse 10 is going to tell us in the next verse, what you do with what God has given you now, with the resources that God has given us in this life, that will determine what he will entrust you with in the next world, in eternity. Verse 10, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Verse 11, therefore, if you have not been faithful with the unrighteous mammon, that is, with the wealth of this life, then who will commit to your trust the true riches? Or better yet, the riches that are to come in the next world. Christian, if we've not been faithful with what God has given us here and now, with unrighteous mammon, with the wealth of this world that will one day inevitably fail, what makes us think that God is going to entrust us with true and eternal riches in his eternal kingdom? I mean, I haven't proven myself worthy with what he's given me here. I've been unfaithful with what God's given me on earth. All I've ever done is what I needed to do. I've done whatever I needed to pad my own resources. And yet there's no investment in eternity, no assets set aside for God's kingdom work. So why would God trust any of us with true riches if that's what we've done with what he's given us? His next question is even more direct in verse 12. The next question is, and if you've not been faithful with what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? If I haven't been faithful with what belongs to somebody else, and in this case, God, what makes you think that God's going to entrust you with something that is your own in eternity? Again, how we handle the little that we have in this world determines how God will entrust, what God will entrust us with. Eternal resources in his kingdom. In other words, Jesus is telling you, and he's telling me, Christian, be smart. This really was a convicting message for me. Of course, they all are, because you're always looking in the mirror as you're working on these. Be smart and think ahead. Can I ask you something? Are you looking toward eternity? Verse 13 is the last verse we're going to look at this morning. And this is where Jesus ties it all together. No servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. Roman slaves, they couldn't have two slave masters, right? They couldn't be loyal to two masters at the same time. They couldn't be equally divided like that. No, a slave would either be devoted to one master or to another. And Jesus is saying that either the slave is to serve and love the one master and hate the other, or else he's going to be loyal to this master over here. And just by default, he'll despise the other. At the end of the verse, you cannot serve God and mammon. When Jesus uses this word mammon or money, he's talking about more than money, obviously, right? I mean, he's referring to really the methods and the values of this world. Kind of like when a reporter, they say, the White House expressed concern for our economy today. Obviously, the White House doesn't speak. It's a building, right? And when they say that, we're talking about the president, maybe someone in his administration. And in the same way, this metonymy here, this use of mammon or money, it's not that money becomes your master, but it says in Timothy, the love of money. The way of life that is focused on serving self. You can either serve yourself or you can serve God. You can't serve both. And the question that we're left with today is, Christian, what is at the center of your life? Because whatever is at the center, the very heart of your life, that is what you serve. And friend, if you are serving it, then it is your master. And if that's your master, then according to this verse, it's your only master. Because you can't have two. That's the point of Luke 16. I was thinking about this message here, and I was moving back to Luke 12. All throughout this study, I was thinking about that rich man and how he hoarded all of those goods. Remember we spoke on this several months ago? In Luke 12, the rich fool, right? He packed up the barns, and they were so full, he tore down the barns, and he got a construction crew, build an entirely new barns, all to prepare for an early retirement. Do you remember what Jesus thought of that man? Remember what he called that man? He called him a fool. And then he said in Luke 12:21, at the end of the parable of the rich fool, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And I want a house. We talk about it probably daily, so we're always looking at the stock market. We're always looking at and I'm always focused on the interest rates and where things are going, and the eternal life of renting. And we put a lot of emphasis in those things in our society today. I put a lot of emphasis in it. We put a lot of focus on our financial investments today. A lot of stress into 401ks and IRAs and all the other things that we can invest in. Things that help us prepare ahead and think about retirement. And there's wisdom in that. I'm not saying that's a foolish thing to do. But the problem is that way of thinking, it's really easy for that to take over, and really to become the focus, where we begin to view our financial resources the way the world views financial stability and resource. And before you know it, we start looking at our finances the way the world does. And we start pulling all of our finances and getting the best investment we can for our retirement, as though retirement was the end. And in doing so, friend, we're forgetting about our eternal retirement. You do remember, Christian, death is not the end, right? You do remember that life doesn't end when we leave this world. Someday you and I are going to go into eternity. Someday you and I are going to stand before God. And whatever we've done with the investments that we've made, those are going to either pay off in eternity or they're not. And if all we've done is plan for our retirement in this life, and we've not planned for anything beyond that, then we've kind of missed the point, haven't we? Of the eternal life that God has given us through Jesus Christ. Because the life that he's given us today, the life that we have now, is our opportunity to invest in our future and to prepare for the life we will have in God's kingdom. You ever hear someone say, you can't take anything with you when you die? I've heard that. Friend, that's not true. At least not for a believer, it's not true. Sure, you can take your favorite car, your boat, your house, but there are a lot of things you can take with you. If you've reared your children and they've come to know Christ, you can take your kids with you when you die. But you can also take your investments. Whatever you have invested, that interest that you've earned, the dividends from the investments that you've used for God, you get to take those into eternity. And we need to remember that. We need to remember the message that Jesus tells us here in Luke 16:1, which is this: use what God gives you with eternity in mind. Use your resources shrewdly for God's kingdom and make an impact for your future. Christian, how is your heavenly portfolio doing? How are your investments in God's kingdom? Are you prepared for retirement? Because we're all going to retire one day. When we leave this life and we enter into our heavenly home, and the question is, are you ready? Are you rich toward God? What are you doing to invest your time and your money? We have an opportunity with these shoe boxes, and I already know they're all going to get done. I'm not worried about that. But the question is, are you going to be a part of that? Because that's an opportunity to invest into your heavenly portfolio, into the retirement that really matters. And as you do, my God promises in the book of Philippians to meet all your needs according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. And as that letter finishes, to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen.